wherever you are joining us in the world today. Welcome to this Global Government Forum webinar titled The Moral Haze, How Civil Servants Can Maintain Legitimacy in an Era of Populism. My name is Richard Johnston and I'm the Executive Editor of Global Government Forum, which is a media and events company focused on bringing together public and civil servants from around the world to share best practice. And today's webinar is on a very interesting topic. Public servants around the world in a lot of different jurisdictions tend to have some form of code or rules that govern their work, which are intended to provide a basis to make sure that the work civil servants do is underpinned by values of integrity, honesty, objectivity, and impartiality. However, that system has come under pressure in recent years in a lot of jurisdictions. Populist governments and political movements have pushed back against these principles through policies that they argue have popular support. Perhaps this was most prominently displayed in the United States under former President Donald Trump, who implemented policies that were challenged and overturned in the courts. For example, he imposed a travel ban that prohibited issuing visas to citizens of 7 largely Muslim countries, for example. And he frequently made statements that were either verifiably untrue or misleading, from the size of the crowd at his inauguration, famously, to the impact of the coronavirus pandemic. And such statements placed public servants in a really difficult position where they had to either defend false statements at a time of national crisis or contradict the president. That, I think, is possibly the example that a lot of people think of when they are kind of mulling the issue of how public servants respond in an era of populism. But other countries have not been immune. In the UK, for example, the government of Boris Johnson took steps to prorogue Parliament to force through his plans for Brexit at one stage, a move that was subsequently deemed unlawful by the courts. And the same government also proposed plans that they said would clarify exit elements of the eventual Brexit deal for Northern Ireland, but do so in a way that ministers admitted would breach international law. And in Canada, the opposition Conservative Party has elected a populist leader in Pierre Poilievre, who has, as an article by the Canadian public broadcaster CBC put it on its website, surfed the internet-fueled, resentment-driven wave that has already flooded American and British politics to the role. So that's just a kind of overview of some of the kind of cases of populism that are kind of spreading across the world at the moment. And even if your government or national politics where you're watching us today hasn't had a populist figure at the forefront of it, the growth of misinformation on social media websites around key policy debates makes the work of public servants more difficult everywhere around the world. So what we want to discuss in this session today is how public servants should act in these circumstances. How can public servants balance the demands from ministers with their own professional ethics and personal ethics? How can structures maintain integrity under political attack? And how can public and civil servants raise concerns over honesty, objectivity, and impartiality of government requests? And we also want to look wider too. How can governments encourage ethical behaviour across the entire public sector? And how can behaviour that falls short of those ethical standards be held to account? We have a great panel to discuss this topic today, and we are very keen to hear from you as well, the public servants who are watching along. We'll have some opening statements, from our panel, who I will introduce momentarily. And then we will have time for questions. So please do submit them using the Q&A button on Zoom that you will see either at the bottom of your screen or on the app as you are using it. And let us know your thoughts on this topic. How well do you feel your government policies and rules around ethics are implemented? Do you feel able and confident to raise concerns when you have them about government policies, and that they will be received in a positive way that will not harm your career? And how do you think governments can tackle misinformation online and kind of help improve the media literacy of citizens to help tackle some of the underlying forces that can put pressure on the workings of an impartial civil service? Please do get in touch. We're keen to hear the reflections of as many of the public and civil servants watching on today as we can around this issue, and I'm happy to voice the questions anonymously if that is the best way to do so. As I say, we've got a great panel for this discussion, so do let me introduce them. Firstly, we're joined by Dr. Claire Gilbert, the director at the Westminster Abbey Institute. Claire is the founding director of the Institute and a public moral philosopher and author with degrees in theology, moral philosophy and ecological ethics. As well as giving lectures, she runs the Institute's Fellows Programme for public servants and provides seminars for government departments to explore the moral dilemmas they face. She has edited and contributed to the Institute's books, including The Moral Heart of Public Service, The Power of Politicians, which won the Parliamentary Book of the Year Award, The Power of Civil Servants, Integrity in Public Life, and Letters from Lockdown. Claire was formerly environmental and medical ethics advisor to the Church of England and a lay canon at St Paul's Cathedral, where she co-founded St Paul's Institute for Ethics. And in 2009, she founded the Ethics Academy, an educational charity teaching ethics through storytelling. And she's also a visiting fellow of Jesus College, Cambridge. So it's great to have Claire with us. And we'll hear opening comments from her shortly. We're also joined today by Michael Vernick, the Jarolowski Chair of Public Sector Management at the University of Ottawa and a former Clerk of the Privy Council and Secretary to the Cabinet in the Canadian Government. Michael had a very distinguished 38-year career in Canadian public service, culminating in serving as the clerk from 2016 to 2019. In addition to his time as clerk, he spent 17 years as a deputy minister, the equivalent to a departmental permanent secretary for those versed in the UK system, making him one of Canada's most experienced and influential public sector leaders. In October 2021, Michael published a book, Governing Canada, a guide to the tradecraft of politics, which serves as a practical handbook for Canada's political leaders and those who aspire to understand them. And in his role as Jarolowski Chair at the University of Ottawa and as a Senior Strategic Advisor Associate at MNP Digital, Michael provides advisory services and mentorship to emerging leaders and to a new generation of students. So again, great to have you with us, Michael. And thirdly, on the panel, we're joined by Angela Glenn, Senior Investigating Officer from the Ethical Standards Commissioner in Scotland. Angela joined the Commissioner's Office in October 2019 as an investigating officer and was promoted to the position of Senior Investigating Officer in November 2020. In that role, Angela co-supervises the investigations team in assessing complaints, conducting investigations and reporting on investigation outcomes when complaints are made against local authority elected members, appointed board members of public bodies, MSPs and lobbyists in Scotland. Angela has a Master of Laws degree from the University of Cambridge, where she specialised in public international law, and she went on to complete a postgraduate certificate in law from the Chinese University of Hong Kong, and she is a member of the Law Society of Hong Kong. So it's a fantastic panel for this discussion, as I'm sure you agree, and we're going to hear some opening comments now from our panelists. So I will ask Claire for her reflections first. Claire.
Well, hello everybody, wherever you are in the world. It's a huge privilege and pleasure to be here. I'm going to talk a bit about the inherent moral discomfort of being a civil servant or public servant, something about the tension between the political and bureaucratic mindsets and the challenge of building trust between officials and politicians. And finally, the importance of civil servants maintaining moral sensitivity and exercising their moral muscle and a little bit about how we do that at Westminster Abbey Institute. So for most of us, the feeling of moral discomfort usually means that something's wrong, and we need to pay attention to it because something's wrong. For civil servants, it comes with the territory, and in fact, it's a sign that you're still a morally healthy civil servant, because you are paying attention not only to enacting the will of the democratically elected minister of the day, you are also behaving as a custodian of propriety. And in the UK, this is particularly felt because in the UK, all civil servants, from the most senior to the most junior, are appointed independently. They're not political appointees. So the division between the bureaucrat and the politician is very clearly marked out. So, and it's in the Civil Service Code that you, of course, enact the democratically elected minister's will, because this is a democracy, not a technocracy. But you also must, always walking alongside that move, attend to what is proper and right. And you must speak truth to power in that respect. And if you're a human being, which all civil servants are at the moment, you're going to have moral antennae. You're going to have feelings about things as to whether they're right or wrong. And they aren't always going to agree with what the democratically elected minister who's given you the policy to enact, they're not always going to agree. So there will be that feeling of discomfort, and you have to pay attention to it, because sometimes it's telling you something you need to pay attention to and act on, and at other times it isn't. And finding a way of knowing when it matters and when you can safely set it aside is one of the arts of being a good civil servant. Just a little bit about this tension between the political and bureaucratic mindset, which I think is probably better understood by civil servants than it is by politicians. But generally speaking, you go into public service in order to make the world a better place. And most public servants are doing that. That's why they go there. But if you go into it as a politician, you go into it with a thought that the best way to make the world a better place is through politics. And it can be quite hard to understand that others might go into public service not thinking that politics is the best way, but thinking, for example, that you might be the one to set up the structures through which policies can be enacted. You might have a different way of seeing it. And we've seen how politicians in the UK have become, and perhaps always have been, somewhat suspicious of the bureaucrat who is trying to enact the policy in the best possible way for the country, which might not be quite the way that the politician wants them to, and certainly might act as a check or balance on the energy of the politician's policy wish. And we've seen this encroaching troublingly, perhaps particularly over Brexit, where there was this accusation, either explicitly or implicitly made against civil servants, that they didn't have the right attitude to Brexit. So we don't know how civil servants voted in the referendum, but it was troubling for a lot of them. But the ones who stayed and decided to make it work would have done so with a thought, well, whether or not I agree with this, I'm going to make it work in the way that's going to do the least damage or be the best for the country. But that's not the same as saying, I really, really believe in this thing and I'm really going to make it work, which is a political energy. It's not a bureaucratic energy. And indeed, you wouldn't want the bureaucratic energy to be, you wouldn't want the bureaucrats to have that kind of energy, because then they might miss something. When we're really, really positive about something we're trying to achieve, we tend to miss quite a lot. You see this in medical research when someone wants to test something for a new treatment. And if it's not in a randomized double-blind trial, they might just see the evidence for the thing that they believe in. It's a well-known problem in scientific research. So you have this huge desire to make something happen, and you're going to make it happen, and all the force of your will goes behind that, but that's not how the bureaucrat thinks. They need to see more than just the thing itself being achieved. They need to see how it's going to be achieved and what harms there might be done on the way. No matter how good the thing that's going to be achieved is, what harms might be done on the way, they need to pay attention to that. And so there is a tension. At its best, it's a really, really good thing, because you have this rush of the political will, and then you have this tempering quality that's actually, in my view, protecting democracy, because democracy is by its very nature volatile. The politicians have to attend to power, and to have some sort of buffer against just that political will is no bad thing at all, in my view. And so for civil servants needing to hold this moral discomfort and not be concerned about it, we spend time with them in private sessions, in entirely safe spaces where it is safe to speak, where we will look at not specific policies, but the ethics of policy drivers, let's say like economic growth, the ethics of economic growth. And we'll look at this all-important relationship between the civil servant and the minister, this critical interface in our democracy, and give civil servants the chance to talk about this stuff in a way that's not going to be made public, where if they stumble into opinions that they feel they perhaps might not express, shouldn't express, it's a safe place to do it. And the effect of this is to, where they talk about it having their moral agency restored to them. It is a bit like a Pilates class where you exercise your core muscles. Here we're exercising our core moral muscles. We're not trying to come to any conclusion. We're simply practicing moral thinking and moral feeling and articulating it. And in particular for civil servants, getting clarity between what might just be an opinion about whether something's a good idea or not, and what's a genuinely important moral concern, and distinguishing between the two. If you don't do that, you might be in danger of simply setting aside all your moral concerns and just doing the will of the minister, and therein lies trouble. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Claire. Really interesting contribution there on exercising the moral muscle, which is a phrase that I very much like. The issues you discussed on the UK side are very pertinent to this conversation, and I'm sure we'll touch on them in the Q&A portion as well. I will use my chair's prerogative at this moment to just share a link with our attendees of another webinar that we hosted that was about that ministerial and civil servant relationship, and how to make that relationship work well, both on a practical level and kind of touching on some of the things that you mentioned there, Claire, because that is a very interesting part, I think, of this dynamic when those people do work so closely together. Thanks for that excellent opening contribution, Claire. We're going to hear from Michael now. Michael.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you for the invitation, and thank you to Claire. I think, Richard, we may have one of those panels where people end up mostly agreeing with each other, so we'll count on the audience to stir things up a bit. I will just offer, I think, some observations drawn from Canadian experience and from being a practitioner, and hopefully provoke some reaction and some dialogue with the people that are joining us today. And also put in a plug for my book, because I do go into some detail about how the permanent secretary role and the clerk's role manages that interface between the political culture and the bureaucratic culture that Claire described. It really is one of the reasons they get the big money and the big jobs is to manage that relationship. So Your promotional material made much of sort of the growth of populism, the wave of authoritarian populism that we're seeing emerge in a number of countries. I mean, I have to say, Canada has yet really to see that kind of populism take flight in our politics. The only adventures I can think of in Canadian history and populist politics were more rural farm protests against the banks and the railways, and in earlier times. But as you alluded to it, we now have the possibility that maybe why you've drawn some Canadians to your audience, that post 2025, we may have a very different government. We now have the most overtly populist contender for government in our history, really, and certainly in generations. A party which is now practicing sort of American-style rage farming is the expression, trying to make people upset and angry, campaigning against the elites, against the state, and so on. And that definitely will have challenges for the public service, even while in opposition. It certainly will make for an interesting government to have to serve if that's the scenario that plays out. I would say that there certainly have been periods of challenges where public servants' moral compass or personal compass has been tested by the currents of politics. The ones that come to mind, and I remember searing experiences of, similar perhaps to your Brexit dynamic, were the attempts by elected Quebec governments to get a mandate for secession from Canada in 1980 and 1995. Very difficult for public servants with Quebec roots and families. If you were a federal public servant who was sympathetic to the separatist cause, or you were a Quebec public servant who was sympathetic to the federalist cause, you were offside your government of the day. And it did raise quite a lively debate about loyalty. Why it was a very, very painful time in many ways. I can see it being relevant in Scotland in some scenarios in the next few years, perhaps. There's been a tension that's particular to Canada, perhaps, and maybe a couple of other countries, of Indigenous public servants who come in and work for the Crown, work for the state, work for the government, which is the source of so much unfortunate history and relationships. And an Indigenous public servant working for the Crown is a tough road. It really is, particularly when there are major crises in politics and events around the issues. And I think that's a particular issue which bears some discussion in the Canadian context. I think recent episodes have revealed which kind of recurrent theme around the role of government scientists, scientists working in government labs for government programs, for government departments, and so on. And they seem to always chafe and feel somewhat constrained that evidence is either being ignored, sometimes feeling that it's being suppressed, that lines of inquiry are being discouraged, and so on. And that sometimes they're working for governments that, to flip the phrase over, are looking for policy-based evidence and not evidence-based policy. And so that relationship has flared from time to time, and I'll come back to that, and it's still a live issue. Just a quick recap on the sort of Canadian architecture in this area, which I hope is familiar to Canadian public servants and maybe of interest to others. The seminal sort of foundational piece of work in this area that some of you will remember is something called the Tate Report from 1996. It's called A Strong Foundation as its working title. I would commend it to anybody. Any Canadian public servant should have read it from cover to cover and thought about it. It was released in 1996 and created a framework of around ethics and values issues for public servants, much along the lines that Claire began to explore: democratic, professional, ethical, people sort of values. And a rich harvest of reviews, seminars, conferences, papers, and it became the benchmark against which, how are we living up to the Tate Report is kind of the Canadian construct for a lot of these debates. It's forgotten by anybody who's younger than me that it actually was released in the maelstrom of Canadian history when national unity had just gone through a sort of a near-death experience in the Quebec referendum. and the most severe downsizing of the public service in Canadian history with tens of thousands of layoffs. And a lively debate about, well, what is public service for? And then John Tate, ran towards the fire and with a group of colleagues put out this report on values and ethics, which really is the foundational piece in Canada. It led to a formal code of values and ethics, which has been updated a couple of times. The most recent version I found on the internet dates from 2012, so it hasn't really been updated for the age of social media yet. That's an interesting question, whether it needs to be and what issues social media environment pops up. I can think of a few. The Canadian architecture, the sort of broad brush, I'll be very quick. I mean, there's an important internal guardrail often, which is legal advice. Monopoly of legal advice from our Attorney General and Department of Justice actually will give advice under a solicitor client saying that thing you're going to do is outside the coloring book of regulations or laws or international conventions and so on. It's often not quite that black and white. If you've ever read government legal opinions, there's a lot of on the one hand, on the other hand, risk assessment kinds of things. And ultimately, I think governments do have the right to make decisions what to do with that advice. But it is a very important function in terms of a lot of the sort of ethics issues that I'll come to. We have built a very heavy infrastructure of oversight and recourse. We have about a dozen officers and agents of parliament, thousands of people work for them, tens of millions of dollars are spent on them. The ones that are relevant here, I think, in particular, we have what's shorthanded as the Whistleblower Commission, which is the Public Servants Disclosure Act, created by the Harper government in 2007, created a Public Service Integrity Commissioner. I'm sure the mandates vary from place to place. And that's become a fairly important thing on things that meet a test of wrongdoing by public servants or by politicians. There, of course, is recourse through the unions and the bargaining units. Often issues that arise, you can go and ask your union reps to look into it. And there's quite a network in Canada of ombudspersons, centers of informal conflict resolution, internal disclosure offices, and that sort of thing. That, on paper at least, there is quite an interesting infrastructure, all of which is probably less than 20 years old. The other big bet has been on transparency, the idea that in a more open environment, sunshine is a cleanser and a deterrent to bad behavior. The working assumption that it will out and you will be caught is a very powerful force on ministers' attempts to bend advice and bend inputs and so on. We have proactive disclosure of all contracts, proactive disclosure of all government grants. We have a structure of registration of lobbyists, rules around what MPs and ministers and public servants can do in their interactions with outside people. We have an annual survey of public servants that should detect hotspots. Come back to that in terms of people felt that they were working in a dodgy environment. It would show up in the annual survey results down to a fairly detailed level. And as I said, the flap about scientific integrity led to a formal agreement in 2017 with the main bargaining unit that represents government scientists. And that is now entrenched in collective agreements that were just renewed, which clarifies, ground and embeds in collective bargaining agreements, principles and guidelines and practices around, the rights of government scientists to publish and participate in scientific inquiry and so on. I wouldn't say the issue has been completely resolved, but that's that was an important step forward. So what are the kinds of issues that recur in Canada these days? Just a survey around, I'm sure the audience can add to this list or reinforce them. I would say, just anticipating my next colleague, there's a noticeable issue around the weaponization of ethics complaints. Because the scope covers both politicians and senior public servants, the same mechanism is basically used as a political weapon. Whoever is the opposition, red, blue, purple, will ask for an ethics investigation into something that a minister's done or the prime minister's done. And frankly, the commissioner can hardly turn it away and refuse to look into it. So then you have several weeks of the government or the minister is under investigation, and that's useful political weapon and so on. And it could be months and even a year later before the findings are, are resolved, by which time the caravan has usually moved on. There are allegations, certainly, about the politicization of policy advice, allegations that political appointments have created, tame watchdogs who are too compliant or too obedient to the government. These are things that are very difficult to prove the contrary of. It's a little bit of prove you're not a witch kind of logic to some of these allegations, and they're usually made by people that don't work inside government and don't see what actually happens, but that's one of my usual sort of reactions to these things. I think the boundaries of government science are always a live issue. We will have that for sure if we have a government which are more climate deniers and climate ditherers come face to face with government scientists on issues around climate policy. And then I would say, moving away from the politics of it, there's constant policing of the boundary around political interference in operations, the attempts by ministers and usually their staffers to nudge staffing and procurement by the public service. And those boundaries must always be policed and defended. But they do, and they, I don't think we have a bad record with that, but vigilance is the price of that. There is the disinformation issue and the question of how far do public servants get drawn into contesting disinformation, speaking up for truth and science and research and evidence, which it makes people squeamish, because to do so and to be more proactive leaves you open to the argument that you're being politicized, you're defending the government of the day, as opposed to defending evidence. So it is a lively debate in Canada right now. I think social media has brought an ongoing debate about the rights of public servants as voters and citizens themselves to free expression and political participation. It's one thing to say that a deputy minister should be politically neutral, but is a relatively transactional and operational staffer out in a regional office. Can they make snarky comments about the government on Twitter or on Facebook and so on? And so we find this, especially with the younger public servants who are used to being on these social media platforms all the time. They chafe at acceptable use codes and guidelines and so on. So I think that is an ongoing challenge, because it's very important, I think, to preserve a brand and a reputation and a reality that the public service is politically neutral and impartial. That's not easy to do if a lot of public servants are chirping on social media and taking sides in issues around the day. There are some issues which we just can't blame on the politicians. A lot of ethical issues that come up are self-inflicted. They're public service on public service issues, internal management, bad bosses, favoritism in hiring and manipulation of evidence that's going up the chain to bosses. Overly compliant, becoming, as Claire said, proponents of a policy and not doing enough work on the due diligence and so on. These are issues within the public service. I guess I'd close on the thing that's most troubling, because, I'd like to give the advice, what should individuals do? Well, use the tools that are there. We have so many of them. Talk to people in your organization. They can't fix things they don't know about, and so on. But what we find is there is a persistent lack of trust and confidence in these mechanisms, that people still feel in Canada far too often that going to these recourse mechanisms is either futile, nothing will be done, or risky, it will leave me open to reprisal. And no matter how many safeguards around anonymity are brought in, how much promotion is done, how much senior officials, say the right things, there is this residual distrust of the internal mechanisms that's still a very big problem in Canada. I wish I had an easy answer to suggest to that, because I would rather fix existing mechanisms than create yet more and add to the proliferation of mechanisms. And I guess the last thing I would say, once you're into reasonably senior positions, is treat your signature as gold. Don't give it away cheaply. Refuse to sign things you don't agree with or don't believe in. Don't just initial something and pass it on. I don't know, this is how you can sort of prove this but I can tell you several examples where I just simply refused to sign off on something. There was a cabinet, a proposal going to cabinet affecting my department when I was in Indigenous Affairs that had basically been created by people at the Treasury and the Finance Department. And they wanted us to propose it to cabinet. And I just refused. I would not, it was bad policy, it was harmful, and I wouldn't sign it. It got to the cabinet table anyway. But my obstinacy on it was noted, I'm sure, but it didn't seem to harm my career because I went on from there. But I think when you are asked to sign something, it means something. It is your name, it is your brand, it is your reputation, and treat it very, very carefully. And I think there are situations. Maybe it's Brexit, maybe it's Quebec separation or Scottish independence or climate policy or things. There are a couple of things where I came very close to the brink of saying, if your personal values or politics are fundamentally incompatible with where the government's going, maybe you should work somewhere else. You should work for a think tank or a university or an NGO or an advocacy group, and you can make contributions to to better country in other ways. They have their own issues and constraints. I still think the public service is one of the best ways to do that. And when the relationship between the public service and democratically elected politicians works, then that's in our best interest. And so my kind of theme these days is keeping our democracy healthy. And in that democracy, there's ample room for democratically elected politicians and for public servants to work together. I'll stop there.
Great, thank you, Michael. Really great contribution. So many things to pick up on that. I mean, just the phrase rage farming is a lovely, succinct summary of my experience of social media. One of the many reasons I'm trying to wean myself off it. You feel the algorithm trying to induce emotions in you. Just to provide a little bit of context, as luck would have it, I was reading the 2022 Public Service Employees Survey that was published by the Government of Canada, I think at the end of May, and just to give you a couple of the answers to the ethical questions from that, just for context. One of the questions asked public servants whether they agreed or disagreed with the statement, if I am faced with an ethical dilemma or conflict between values in the workplace, I know where I can go for help in resolving the situation. So strongly or somewhat agree with that, agree to that. The answer to that statement was at 70% of respondents, but down slightly, down 3 percentage points from the last time the survey was conducted in 2020. And then there was a second statement, my department or agency does a good job of promoting values and ethics in the workplace. Again, strongly or somewhat agree with that statement was 72% of respondents, again, slightly down from the last time the survey was conducted in 2020, down 2 percentage points from 2020. So that's just I thought that was a useful little aid memoir to what you were saying, Michael, but obviously then there's the issue around trust comes alongside that, whether people know where to go and whether they trust the result of the process that results. That's really interesting. And now we're going to hear from Angela, perhaps a little bit more practically on kind of how we can enforce the kind of ethical standards in public service roles. Angela.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you all for having me. It's really an honor. And you're absolutely right. We're coming from the angle as the enforcer. I recognize that this is a hugely international audience. So I thought it would be helpful to first start off with a brief background of the Ethical Standards Commissioner for Scotland as an office and what we do, and then I will turn to the opening comments for today's topic. So the Ethical Standards Commissioner for Scotland, or the Commissioner, is an independent office holder appointed by the Scottish Parliament. Our current Commissioner is Mr. Ian Bruce, who would have loved to be here today if not for a prior commitment. The Commissioner has two hands. So firstly, we as an office regulate ministerial appointments to public body boards and publishes and enforces a code of practice for appointments. On the other hand, we receive, assess, investigate, and report on complaints about local authority elected members, board members of Scottish public bodies, and members of Scottish Parliament. I'll call them MSPs for short. We do not cover complaints about Scottish ministers or their conduct. There is a separate ministerial code of conduct, which is enforced by the Office of the First Minister for Scotland. We refer our reports about investigations and findings on misconduct about councillors and board members to the Standards Commission for Scotland, or SCS for short. We refer reports and findings on complaints about MSPs to the Scottish Parliament's Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee, which is the SPPA committee. So between the SCS, our office, and the SPPA committee, we are an integral part of the ethical standards framework that's been established to promote integrity in public life in Scotland. The Commissioner's role and functions are all set out in primary legislation. He is not subject to the direction or control of any member of the Parliament, any member of the Scottish Government, or the Parliamentary Corporation in the exercise of his statutory functions. He is also what is termed a prescribed person, such that staff complaining about a breach of an applicable code of conduct are afforded whistleblower protection and status in certain circumstances. So on my part, I am one of the managers of the team which handles, investigates, and reports on complaints about alleged breaches of a code of conduct. Each code of conduct for councillors, board members, and MSPs covers broadly similar themes. They're all based on the key principles of public life, some of which Richard had already mentioned earlier, and they all follow a kind of general format. They cover general conduct, such as disrespect, bullying, and harassment. Nowadays, it's been extended to cover sexual harassment. They also have a section covering declaration of interests. This is financial interests or non-financial interests. And lastly, there's always a section which covers conduct in quasi-judicial settings. As a team, we have observed a consistent trend across the last 5 years that a vast majority of persons engaging with our service, complaining to us, to our office, they are members of the public. As of just last year, in 2022 to 23, which are our last financial year, complaints from members of the public accounted for about 80% of the total number of complaints we received. The second largest group of complainers are local authority elected members complaining about other elected members. So in a way, that's politicians complaining about politicians. And this is followed by the third largest group, which is local authority officials complaining about elected members. We also observe an increasing trend over the last 5 years where complaints we receive relate to allegedly disrespectful behavior. This includes bullying and harassment. There's also an increasing number of complaints citing comments or posts that are made on social media, such as Twitter and Facebook, as evidence of alleged misconduct. Now, against that background, today's topic sets out to explore in part how public and civil service structures can maintain integrity under political attack and how to be transparent in our role. We're also exploring how we, either as public servants or as regulators like myself, we could raise concerns over honesty, objectivity, and impartiality of government requests. I'm sure we will be unpacking this in much more detail throughout the webinar, but just to start off on my initial thoughts, as an ethics watchdog, how do we maintain our office's integrity in a political context? I think broadly there are at least two key foundations. The first being a commitment to our own values. This expressly includes the values of honesty and transparency. As an office, we follow a set of published values that were subject to an extensive public consultation, and we always operate under the guiding question of what is the right thing to do. And Claire, what you were saying about having our moral core being well exercised. That is our day-to-day work. That is how we respond every day with the cases that we come up with, complaints that we receive. Values are the guide in our day-to-day work and are a fundamental element to our recruitment, our induction, our training of staff, everything that we do. They're reflected in our own codes of conduct, and we translate that to the work that we do. For instance, how do we reflect openness and honesty and transparency in our work? We do it by publishing all of our processes, policies, and procedures. In March this year, we published for the first time in our history as an office an investigations manual which covers all of the processes that we have in logging, assessing, investigating, and reporting on complaints. And all of our templates have also been published as an appendix. So that would include internal forms that we use to assess and report. Everyone will be able to access this, and anyone who has reason to engage with us will know what to expect and can be assured that we are handling their complaints in a consistent process and using consistent approaches. We also consulted extensively on adopting a new approach where the complaints we receive are shared with the person who's being complained about. So that's the councillor, the board member, and the MSP. And this is done regardless whether the complaint is accepted for investigation or not. The complainer will also know that the respondent has been informed of that complaint against them. And in our view, that shows, and it's us demonstrating in real life what it is like to be honest and transparent in our work. I think the second foundation to what we do is a commitment to maintaining neutrality. Our published strategic plan states that we investigate and report on complaints without fear or favor. And I think that is it's not anywhere published or official, but I think it is our unofficial motto as an office: without fear or favor. We do not provide any advice on making a complaint, nor do we comment on speculative or potential complaints. All staff required to maintain their own register of interest, which we update regularly, at least annually as minimum. We declare any conflicts. We work in adherence to our own internal code of conduct, and all staff are recruited on the basis of merit and their demonstration primarily of how they fit our values and our approach. We know that politicians can and do complain about each other. The second highest category of complainers are politicians. It is entirely possible that this system of ours is being used to, the complaint being lodged with our office is a way of undermining or attacking political opponents. In particular, if there's been a finding of a breach of the code and a sanction is being applied, that is definitely political ammo. However, because of the nature of our role, we do not consider political motivation behind complaints as a factor in whether or not we'd accept them for investigation or not, or whether there's a breach or not, or whether we'd report. Ultimately, the criteria is whether the alleged conduct could amount to a breach of the code. If it does, the complaint is investigated, and if substantiated, that is considered against that code, and a referral is made to the appropriate adjudicative body. We acknowledge that our office can be used as that kind of political scoring system, so we maintain our objectivity, neutrality, integrity, even where we function in a highly politicized context, by not considering the political reasons behind each complaint. Of course, we do seek to understand the background of the complaint, which could contain political discourse, but it is not a reason for us to close the complaint, nor is it in itself enough for us to make a breach or no breach finding. Notwithstanding all of this, we're also mindful of the impact of our investigatory work, and we are committed to treating everyone who comes into contact with us with empathy, kindness, and respect. And that is set out in our values as well. I can clearly only speak fairly knowledgeably about the ethical standards framework in Scotland. Given the topic of today's webinar, I'd really encourage everyone to become familiar with the ethical standards framework that applies in your own countries. I anticipate that each of you will be subject to your own codes of conduct, and that the politicians with whom you work with will in turn be subject to their own. Become familiar with these in order to understand what your respective responsibilities are, particularly in cases in which conduct appears to be of concern and should be reported. It is not enough for ethical frameworks to be in place. People need to use them if good conduct in public life is to be maintained at all. And that's my initial observations. I think the floor will now be open for questions.
Great, thank you, Angela. And yes, please do get your questions coming in. We are now moving into the question and answer portion of our webinar. That was really interesting, Angela, particularly the issue around how you deal with complaints that come from politicians about other politicians in response to Michael's comments about the weaponization of ethics complaints, and that you have to judge it on the basis of the code and not the kind of originator of the complaint, which I think is a really interesting point and probably a sensible way to go about it. I'm going to use the chair's prerogative briefly to touch on a couple of points from the conversation that came up. Particularly, I was going to put this to Claire in the first instance. Something Michael said really caught my ear about having had moments, and Michael, you can come back in after this, where when you've kind of mentioned, or public servants that you were working with were kind of speaking about concerns on policy, and you were advising them whether they would better go work in another area of kind of public policy, whether a think tank or something like that, where perhaps they're not as closely bound as some of the strictures in public service itself. How much, in your experience, Claire, are civil servants kind of dealing with that calculation in their head, that there are other ways to do public good that perhaps would allow them more freedom to kind of express their own views and perhaps take an ethical stand, or are the people you speak to kind of committed to the idea of public service and want to make it work within the kind of existing ethical framework that they've kind of entered into?
The civil servants with whom I work on the whole tend to be at quite a senior level, and my experience is that it's extremely well understood that this is a particular way of doing public service, which is politically impartial and enacts the democratic will regardless of the colour of the government, and that the real concern is to get clearer in their own minds where the things that they're concerned about need to be things that they should be concerned about as civil servants, and speaking to the minister about it, or asking for an instruction, or taking the various steps that can be taken according to the Civil Service Code, and where it's simply a difference of opinion and then can be safely set aside. That's where their concern is. I think the understanding that it's a different kind of energy, it's a different kind of way of being of service, and it is very much to do with your own temperament is my observation. So if you, I mean, I know I couldn't be a civil servant, for example. I have the wrong energy for it, and I would be arguing too much. The kind of patience which I have such admiration for, because I don't really have it myself, the kind of patience that you need to deal with people who don't necessarily understand the issues, well, usually don't understand the issues as well as you do, and don't see as you feel they should. So it's a particular kind of energy that you need. I think, as I say, I think it's the politicians who don't necessarily understand this. In my experience, don't necessarily understand that this is absolutely a way of serving the public that's not political, that's patient and quite self-sacrificial, actually, on the part of civil servants.
Great, thank you. And just to allow you to come back on that, Michael, were those kind of conversations that you had frequent with public servants, where they were kind of considering the right kind of element of public life in which to work? And would you say that was something that might be kind of increasing in frequency or magnitude?
Well, let me sort of narrow the scope of this a little bit. I mean, I think this is a conversation and a tension largely found in Westminster systems, which assume a certain continuity of public service as institutional support. Sorry, can you hear me? Yep. Okay. You can do it another way. In the American system, 50,000 public servants change if there's a change of regime, and it's totally normal that you expect the senior layers of the public service to be aligned with the administration of the day, and when the administration changes, you leave, and the American system compensates for that. There's a whole reservoir of foundations and think tanks and other places where the team goes out when they're out of government and so on. And that system can be made to work. The German political service, senior civil service, is very political, very politicized. The French one, obviously, and so on. So I think we're talking a little bit about the Westminster system. And the usual thing I say is that, there are 320,000 public servants in Canada. Most of them come in every day, work on services, operations, transactions, internal services, and ministers and policy are a very distant thing. Every once in a while, a law or program will get turned over by the government and they have to implement it. But I think this is largely an issue for people that work in the very small sort of space of the policy development community. It comes up, I think that, and I always get into trouble when I talk about this, because you risk being seen to be too obedient. The attack of you are too complacent and too obedient to the government of the day. I always try to explain it as there's a bargain there of supporting democratic politics, that whoever comes in, team red, team blue, whatever their suspicions and their experiences from being outside of government or in opposition, and there's this initial 6 to 12 months of enormous mutual suspicion. And one of the things that you have to do in the first year is break that down and form working relationships and create as quickly as possible trust. With some ministers, that's never possible. Like, they are so partisan in their mindset, they cannot, they see how could you have been working for the other side just 12 months ago? How do you, they never grasp it. But the clever ministers realize that they can mobilize the strengths of the public service in terms of analysis and delivery and get things done and help me, tick things off the list the prime minister has given me to do. So, mostly it works. Sometimes it doesn't. I would think. I think it's, the relatively small sort of issues where if the government shifts, you get a major change in focus. Criminal justice has been one in Canada. Climate change has been one here, and in Australia, a lot of zigzagging. The next government may just tear down carbon pricing schemes and energy regulation, which public servants have just spent the last 6 or 7 years building. There were changes in child support policies and so on. But in other areas, there's just continuity. You work on something like the legislation on disability accessibility. It carried on to the next government. You worked on cannabis legalization. The next government didn't repeal it, and so on. So I think it's not to sort of belittle the importance of it, but it's a relatively compact set area of the public service that works in the policy space in contested areas, where this comes up a lot. And that's where I had conversations. And it's just that you can tell, I like the phrase that Claire uses of the energy and the mindset that comes with that. Some people come into government passionate in the best sense of the word that they're going to change things in the environment or social justice or Indigenous peoples or whatever. And they have trouble accepting or coming to terms with the fact that team red or team blue may have a different set of priorities. They may have very different solutions. And I guess my last point, because I always try to squeeze this in, is the public service has to be humble about its own limitations and biases. That I really don't like the truth to power metaphor, because it assumes that the public service has truth. Yes, it has support and analysis and advice and things that are important, but the public service has its own biases and go-to behaviors. So,
yes, absolutely. It's a very good phrase, truth to power, but I think it perhaps encapsulates something different from what is truly useful. And not that I could come up with a better one. That's beyond my linguistic skills. Yes. We've had a question in from Ken Moshi, which is directed at Angela. So I'll put it to Angela. Which is Ken asks, I imagine all complaints need some initial investigation. Does your office have an issue with a high number of politically motivated complaints that clog up the system? If so, how do you approach this issue? It's kind of asking to expand on the point you made, Angela, about the kind of elements of the complaints. Perhaps not only from other kind of council members, but kind of political motivation overall. Do you kind of have to investigate, have a high number of kind of politically motivated complaints that you need to weed out the system?
I think that's a very good question, and it recognizes one of the big challenges that we experience on a day-to-day basis. So I think it might be helpful to cover kind of our process. So with the initial investigations, yes, there would be an initial investigation. It depends on which legislation we're talking about. If it's councillors and board members of public bodies, the legislation is quite clear that before an actual investigation, you can have an assessment, and the assessment stage, or we call that also stage one, is a exercise where we go through kind of, is this a complaint about a local authority member, which council is it? It's just a very kind of general questions that we go through. But at its core, it's always going to be, is there a breach of the code? Is the conduct that's being complained of actually covered by the code? Is it within a certain time frame, or if it isn't within a time frame, are there overriding reasons that we should take it forward? And that's it. If it takes, I don't like using tick boxing, tick box as a phrase, but it matches all of that criteria, then it does progress into stage 2 investigation. So on the kind of MSP side, every complaint that we get under the legislation begins as an initial investigation. So we require to investigate every MSP complaint that we receive. The question of volumes, complaint volumes, the number is high. We do get a lot of complaints, but as I said, most of them are from, a vast majority of them are from members of the public. So of that number, they would not be politically motivated. It would really be a smaller number that we're looking at, are really kind of tit for tat complaints, like you complained about me. In order to say that you could complain about me and that I'm being investigated, therefore I will complain about you, and you have to say that you're being investigated. But yeah, it really touches on a very live issue in our office. I think Michael wants to come in.
Yeah, Michael, do you want to come in there?
Well, just again on terminology, just because it's politically motivated doesn't mean it isn't founded. You know, they may be onto something, and the typical cycle of one of these things in my experience is it's actually something that pops up in a news story. A journalist is onto something that gets raised in question time, and then the opposition critic files a complaint with every conceivable recourse body so that the minister will be under investigation. But sometimes where there's smoke, there's fire.
I'll put this question to Claire in a second or two. It's from Phil Miller. I'll just provide a little bit of context first. Phil asks, who, if anyone, polices failures to comply with the UK Civil Service Code, rules, regulations and legislation, as many civil servants have no faith in the Civil Service or the Civil Service Commission to police itself. You kind of half answer the question there, Phil, in that the Civil Service Commission is the body that is entrusted with the policing of the code. We don't have anyone from the Commission on this call, so I don't really want to speak for them. But they publish an annual report that sets out the extent of civil service code investigations, and also does some survey work in terms of the extent to which UK civil servants are aware of the code and kind of know how to access it, similar to access the work of the Commission, similar to the statistics I provided earlier on Canada. But I mean, you may be right, Phil, in saying that that civil servants themselves don't have faith in the Commission, or indeed the internal elements of the civil service to do policing of rules and regulations. And we've seen certainly around ministerial code breaches under Boris Johnson's time as Prime Minister, where ministerial code breaches were found to be proven by the independent investigator, but the Prime Minister kept the minister in place. So that caused a lot of disquiet, I know, amongst civil servants that the code could be breached for ministers, and yet they would not lose their job. Claire, I said I wanted to put it to you in terms of your thoughts in terms of the code and its effectiveness, and whether that is a good kind of mechanism to kind of help police some of these moral quandaries.
I can't really add any more facts than to what you said, Richard. I suppose I have a inherent concern that if we do just rely on codes, we're going to miss important issues, and that there isn't enough ink in the world or bandwidth to write the rules we need if that's the thing that's going to make us good. And actually my greater interest is in doing what it takes to generate cultures of high standards and norms of high standards, and more than that, a real wish, not, you know, it's really interesting to talk about this stuff. It's really interesting to think about it. There's something really attractive about or I think a good moral thinking, it's an attractive thing. It's something to attract people to make them want to think about how best to behave, and not an atmosphere of fear or indeed confusion. If you start to write too many rules, people stop having any faith in their own moral sense and think, well, I've just got to obey the rules and I don't know if I agree with them or not. And I'm simply, to go back to my analogy, not using this moral muscle myself at all. Nevertheless, codes are important, and it's been fantastic to hear Angela's explication of how that's done in her office in Scotland.
Michael, do you have any thoughts on the effectiveness of codes as a mechanism for dealing with ethics and government?
I think they're useful in clarifying expectations on all parties. They're useful in the relationship to the public. You know, that the less that government is a black box and impenetrable, you know, the better, frankly, in dealing with sort of the attacks on government and the state as this sort of black box of elite that's out of touch and so on. Anyway, that go back to the populism with which we started the whole session. But I totally endorse where Claire was going, which is you cannot rely on just compliance with rules and procedures. You know, follow the manual and you will stay out of trouble is not enough. That's the old approach. You have to develop values and organizational culture at the level of the organization and the individual. And so there is training and development, and you know, but what matters, what's the most corrosive, I think was in your comments as well, is people have to see proof points in the consequences and the sanctions and the revealed behaviors. It's not the elegant sort of speeches from the deputy secretary, you know, permanent secretary or whatever. It's people are very, very clever at picking up the signals of what is really going on here. And so you have to provide proof points from time to time that these things are being used.
Thanks, Michael. Apologies to Michaela Brady. Her question was, in terms of populism, do you believe that transparency and neutrality is enough to combat mistrust? I think we've just answered that, Michaela, without me quite putting your question to the panel. I hope that's sufficient. We are almost up against time. It's been a fantastic conversation. I just want to give the panel a kind of chance for any closing thoughts, perhaps framed by the last couple of responses, starting with Claire, on the kind of culture and creating the kind of ethos in an organization of ethical behavior and using that moral muscle. I mean, very bluff question from a journalist with 5 minutes to go in a session, but how do you create that culture? What would your kind of tips be to people who are watching along about the things that they should be thinking in their own organization to create that culture?
Pay attention to it is the first thing. There has been far too much attention paid to procedures and processes as a response to problems and things that have gone wrong. I think it's the work that we do at Westminster Abbey Institute, and there's all too little of it. I wish incidentally, the electorate would write to their politicians and say, we really want you to spend a bit of time on moral character because we think this will make you a better leader, because it doesn't really work at the ballot box, and that makes it very difficult for politicians to give time to this kind of work. But it really is like going to a regular Pilates class. It's something you have to attend to and make time for and do really interesting work around that we can die on over words like training. We can get really bored by being made to do stuff. But this, in my experience, moral philosophy is really interesting and should be made attractive, and it should be prevalent in public servants, that kind of practice.
Michael, do you have any thoughts on kind of times that perhaps in your career where you've felt the organization you were working in has got that kind of culture embedded, and kind of what the kind of key signifiers of that were?
I would allege, and people will disagree with me, that the federal service in Canada is generally healthy. There are obviously going to be pockets that, abscesses, so to speak, that pop up in particular organizations from time to time. The important thing from the episodes is to learn from them. So, I agree with everything Claire said, but I would say that, there's value in this kind of event and seminars and the case study approach and making people work through the discussions and structured animated group sessions and do it early in their careers, before. I think a lot of this happens to the middle manager, and by then it's a bit late. You need to sort of make this an integral part. I have in other contexts called for a doubling or tripling of investment in training and leadership development in our service. And this is certainly part of the core software that we need to instill.
And Angela, just any closing comments from you, perhaps framed by whether you know what happens after your investigations. I wonder if the investigations that the office undertakes are then used by the authorities or the public bodies to kind of improve the culture, kind of to embed more ethical approaches. Can we make it a positive feedback loop?
I think absolutely. I have every hope for that. And I was just writing down. I agree with Claire that codes are not enough. Codes, and that's a lot coming from me because codes are our bread and butter for my team. But they are only as good as the engagement with it, with testing it, understanding it, really feeling and just having the visibility of seeing how it lands. And that touches on, Richard, what you were saying with what happens to after our cases get through. It works out to about less than 10% of the complaints that we receive actually make it to a hearing. And then at the hearing, there is a decision for a sanction. I don't know what that number really represents. It is really open for interpretation, but a code really is, any ethical standards framework is really as good as its engagement with it. So I would always encourage, if you see something, if something doesn't sit right with you or make you feel uncomfortable, there are regulatory bodies like ourselves. It's our job, it is our duty to look through, receive those complaints and consider them and take them very seriously. And in the spirit of that, I've got nothing further to add.
Thank you very much, Angela, and thank you to everybody for joining us today. That is where I'm going to bring today's session to a close. It's been an absolutely fascinating discussion. It's really flown by. So yes, many thanks to all of our panel for joining us today, and for everybody for watching along too. And thank you for contributing the questions. You'll be receiving a recording of this session when it is available in the next few days. through email, and there will also be a report from this webinar in the next few weeks too. Before that though, there is a survey that will be in your inbox very shortly to get your thoughts on today's webinar, and it would really help me and the team here at Global Government Forum to make sure we're providing the best possible content for you if you could complete that. And also any ideas on topics you would like to see us explore in future webinars would also be welcome. We run a wide range of webinars here at Global Government Forum, so please also keep an eye on our website, globalgovernmentforum.com, where you will find out details of all our latest webinars, as well as the news and editorial coverage that public servants need to do their jobs well. We try and cover as many interesting government innovations as we possibly can, so please do visit globalgovernmentforum.com and sign up for our daily email news bulletin. So yes, thanks again to everybody for joining the session today, and we hope to see you at another one of our webinars soon. Wherever you are, enjoy the rest of your day.